All right, let's dive into a question that just never seems to go away. Is there reincarnation in the Bible? Now, I know it's a topic a lot of people just dismiss out of hand, but the real story is so much more interesting than a simple yes or no. In this explainer, we're going to unpack how one specific interpretation became the only story we hear.
So, let's get right to the heart of it. Did the first Christians, the ones living in the centuries right after Jesus, believe in reincarnation? This isn't just some theological brain teaser. It's a real historical mystery. What did people actually think about where the soul goes? And here's the thing. The answer isn't a simple no. Not at all. The real story here is about a battle of ideas. It's about how one specific interpretation managed to triumph over all the others to become the accepted truth. And we're going to see exactly how that happened. To really get this, we've got to start with the Bible itself and look at these two core ideas that were kind of in conflict right from the very beginning. So on one side, you have resurrection, and that's the idea you're probably most familiar with. One life, one death, and then, way down the line, this miraculous transformation of the whole person, body and soul together. But on the other side, you've got rebirth, or reincarnation, the idea of many lives, where the soul gets recycled into new bodies to keep learning and growing. These are two fundamentally different ways of looking at the human journey. Now, you have to remember, early Christianity was not this one single organized thing. The historian of religion Elaine Pagels puts it so perfectly. She says it wasn't a choir singing in unison, it was more like a city full of small houses with different lights on in every window. There was a ton of diversity in what people believed. Okay, so let's dig into our first real piece of evidence. It's a puzzle in the text that has been fueling this debate for 2,000 years. It's called the Elijah Enigma. So in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says something pretty startling about John the Baptist. He says, if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. Now, if you're looking for hints of reincarnation, that sounds like a smoking gun, right? A direct link between two souls. But here's where it gets tricky. In another part of the story, when people ask John the Baptist directly, hey, are you Elijah? His answer is a flat, I am not. So what gives? Who's telling the truth? This contradiction is the core of the whole enigma. So how do you solve this puzzle? Well, it really boils down to two ways of looking at it. The first is literal identity. John the Baptist is the actual reincarnation of the prophet Elijah. The second is what's called a prophetic role. John isn't literally Elijah, but he's here to fulfill the same symbolic job, coming in the spirit and power of Elijah. So why did the spirit and power interpretation become the standard one? Well, here's the key. It was safer. It protected the neat and tidy story of one life, one death, one resurrection. It let the church keep the poetic connection without cracking open the door to the much messier, more destabilizing idea of multiple lives. And this whole thing with the Elijah Enigma, it wasn't just a one-off debate. It was actually part of a much bigger trend where the early church started to standardize what people should believe. They were literally drawing lines in the sand. Okay, so before we go further, there's this one key idea we need to unpack, the pre-existence of the soul. This is the belief that your soul existed somewhere else before it was born into your body. Now, it's not the same as reincarnation, but it's a very closely related idea that some big early Christian thinkers were definitely kicking around. You had brilliant thinkers, like the early theologian Origen, who were exploring all these incredibly complex ideas about the soul's journey. But as the church grew and became more of an institution, the leadership started to see this kind of open-ended thinking as, well, a little dangerous. It was destabilizing. And this is where things really shift. Elaine Pagels just nails it when she explains that once an idea gets officially labeled a heresy, the conclusion that the idea is wrong becomes the starting point for every future argument. It's no longer a question to be explored, it's a threat to be shut down. So when you boil it all down, these lines were drawn for really practical reasons. They wanted to prevent confusion for everyday people, they needed to create a single, unified community, and maybe most importantly, they had to protect that central promise of resurrection from any competing ideas. Okay, now let's talk about power, because when Christianity went from being this underground movement to being tangled up with the Roman Empire, everything changed. The incentives were totally different. The moment Christianity started gaining real institutional power, theological unity wasn't just a nice spiritual goal anymore. It became a political necessity. You can't run an empire with a religion that's fractured into a dozen different belief systems. You need one clear, enforceable story for the sake of social order.
And you can really see the mechanics of it here. Think about it. A one life, one judgment system, that creates this incredible moral urgency. It gives a centralized authority a very clear, powerful role. On the other hand, a system of many lives, that encourages a slower, long-term kind of growth. Authority becomes much more decentralized and fluid. For a massive, empire-wide institution, the choice was pretty clear. The metaphysical researcher Dolores Cannon just puts it so bluntly. She says, reincarnation can be a beautiful, expansive idea for an individual person, but it is incredibly inconvenient for any system, religious or political, that needs you to make a single urgent decision, a single moment of compliance.
So the big takeaway here is that the choice to reject ideas like reincarnation wasn't always a purely spiritual debate. A lot of the time, it was a social and political decision made to create stability and unity that just got dressed up in the language of absolute metaphysical truth.
So, where does all this leave us? After looking at the texts, the doctrine, the politics, let's pull it all together and see how this one verdict was finally reached.
So, to sum it up, how did the no reincarnation view win? It was really a combination of three big things. First, a heavy textual focus on resurrection. Second, the deliberate creation of doctrinal boundaries to shut down speculation. And third, really powerful social and political incentives that just favored a single unified story.
And this brings us to this final, really powerful idea, again from Dolores Cannon. Doctrine is not the same thing as reality. A doctrine is a story that a community agrees to tell itself, to live by. It's like a map. But a map is never the entire territory of what reality is, or what consciousness can do. Which leaves us with a final question to really think about. What happens when a tradition's story stops being a helpful lens to see the world through and instead becomes a wall? A wall that actually defines the limits of what you're even allowed to think.